It's hard to forget the impact and the influence that Telltale Games once had. The Walking Dead, The Wolf Among Us, it really felt like the studio birthed an entire genre, really cementing that consequence-focused episodic story game that so many studios tried to replicate as a mainstay of the early 2010s. Seriously, it seemed like Telltale was absolutely killing it all the way up until about 2016, where it was pretty clear that something about how the business was running was just not working. There was a definitive hit to the quality of work that they were outputting, and then suddenly, the studio laid off about 90% of its staff without warning on the 21st of September 2018, before liquidating the company just 2 months later. And just like that, after years of decline, a titan of the industry had fallen. And to be honest, it kind of seemed like that entire genre of video game had gone along with it. And then along came a little game called Dispatch. Of course, there are a few more steps in there, which we will get into, but there is one thing about Dispatch that I found absolutely fascinating, and it's something that I haven't really seen being discussed, and hopefully I'm going to be able to elucidate that in this video. I think it's incredibly interesting when games speak to some fundamental aspect of the human experience, when they speak to loss or love, to grief or to forgiveness. Sometimes they can be about all of these, and sometimes they aren't, and that is part of the magic of the medium for me. The one thing about Dispatch though, I think it has one fundamental theme that exists in practically every character's story. It permeates the experience right down to its very DNA. It exists both in the core of the narrative through to the way that Ad Hoc so expertly brought it into existence, and it's that Dispatch is fundamentally a story about second chances. Do you ever think about why we find stories about superheroes to be so compelling? I think there's a few reasons, many of which stem from the idea that these insane situations that these characters can find themselves in often tend to map onto experiences we've had in our own lives. Look, I'm not saying that normal people can relate to being transformed into a super soldier to fight Nazis over a mysterious gem from outer space. I don't know. Maybe you can. But what is so fundamentally engaging about these stories is that a character, through sheer force of will and a little help from some superpowers, can overcome a seemingly insurmountable obstacle or situation, and the drama that comes along with it. This idea of overcoming hardship, it's inherently compelling because we, as people, have all had our own struggles in life. It's seldom an easy road to walk. There is one problem, however, in that the world-ending consequences of alien invasions or super AIs wreaking havoc on the world are often a little too fantastical to really be relatable. And as hard as it is to do the fucking dishes sometimes, it really is one battle after another out here, chat. It can be a little bit challenging to draw parallels between Captain America and your own life. Some stories try to alleviate this by interspersing family drama, romance, and the like in between these intense action sequences. I think something like Invincible tackles this really well, actually, but there is an important distinction in the way that Dispatch handles this dynamic. Robertson, Mecha Man, whatever you want to call him, don't get me wrong, he is definitely a superhero, but perhaps more importantly, he's also just a guy. He's no genius, billionaire, playboy, philanthropist. He's just a fucking guy. He goes to work and he tries to do what's right. And in that, he is immediately more relatable of a character than someone like Tony Stark. Just like the rest of the cast, they may be influential or scary or hot-headed, but they are fundamentally people. And the Z team, despite being downtrodden, dealt seemingly every bad hand in the book, they are fundamentally just like everyone else. There's this endearing quality to practically every single character, from Sonar to Prism, and yes, even Flambe, even if he is a fucking asshole. Dispatch is a story about superheroes, yes, but it's far more a story about people, and I think the decision to set it primarily in a space like an office does a lot to offset that inherently unrealistic premise. It's about hopes and dreams. It's about love. It's about starting again when life doesn't go your way. And I think the best way to approach this is through Invisigal. We're initially introduced to Invisigal in quite an awkward way. If you're unfamiliar, Robert Robertson is a superhero with no powers, and in that, he's hired at the SDN, the Superhero Dispatch Network, as a dispatcher after his trusty mech suit is destroyed and he's forced to retire from superhero duties. Invisigal sneaks into a conference room and pervs on Robert whilst he's getting changed into company uniform, and it's immediately apparent that for our needs as a dispatcher, she is going to be trouble. Invisigal is the corpo-friendly name for ex-supervillain Invisibitch, who joined up with the SDN under the Phoenix program, an initiative that allows supervillains to reform and put their unique abilities to use for the betterment of society. The Z-Team, just think of them as some kind of suicide squad, are just that, Phoenix program recruits that are definitely not hitting their KPIs, worst of all being Invisigal. In said conference spying, she learns of Robert's identity as Mecha Man, something that Blonde Blazer, the head of that branch of the SDN, desires to keep from the rest of the employees, as his past as a superhero might compromise his ability to work with some members of the Phoenix program. We don't know a lot about Invisigal initially, but similar to Robert at this point, she's sort of rudderless in a way. We know she's hot-headed, doesn't like to follow instructions, and that she's performing really poorly at the SDN. In fact, she's performing so badly that she's first in line to go when Blazer decides to cut someone from the Z-Team. And as Judgment Day comes around, she initially tries to walk away from the team, and would have done so if it wasn't for Robert recognizing some potential in her. And I think it says something really important about being seen. I had a really rough time in my last year of high school. I'm not going to go too far into it, but we all understand the stress that can come along with a bunch of different things in your life all going wrong at the same time. So let's just say shit sucked and it started to affect my grades. I honestly felt like at the time there was nobody I could really go to until one day one of my teachers noticed and just sat and talked to me at lunch. It wasn't judgmental, it wasn't just because he had to. He saw someone struggling and he cared enough to know. And even now, almost 10 years later, I still remember that conversation quite vividly. Invisigal had been downtrodden for what we can assume to be practically her whole life. She lacks direction. She sees her powers as an affliction of sorts, that she's destined to be bad because at least in her mind, that's what her abilities decree. But to be seen, to be known, all because someone cared enough to know. It is a very powerful thing, and it's enough to pull Vizzy out of that rut and put her on a path to redemption. One of my favorite scenes in the game is when she looks at the leaderboard in the office and sees herself no longer at the bottom after her shift and not knowing that Robert and Chase are watching. Pulls out her phone, takes a picture of it. It isn't much, but it says a lot about the nature of mentorship, and it tells you so much about Invisigal as a character. Sometimes you don't need to be fixed. You don't need someone to give you all the answers. You just need someone that will show you some compassion and give you the time of day to remind yourself that you're capable of bringing yourself through almost anything. And I think there's a lot that we can take from that. Vizzy's whole arc is about looking for another shot at life, trying to recover when everywhere you look is pain. So much so that I'd probably argue that she's the most influential character in the whole story, even more so than Robert. But I think one of the most interesting narrative threads is the semi-antagonistic relationship between her and Chase, where Robert acts as sort of a mentor for Invisigal. Chase has been with Robert in that capacity from a young age, and while Chase obviously cares very deeply for Robert, that deep-seated concern leads to an almost protective relationship when he joins up with the SDN. I don't know if it's jealousy or a proclivity to look after those closest to him, but Chase is very skeptical of the bond that forms between Robert and Vizzy as he leads the Z-Team. To Chase, something about her story never quite added up, as when she joined the SDN, she specifically requested not to go into her prior circumstances as a villain. And yeah, she's kind of shit at her job also, prompting a more reserved approach. But when Robert starts to get close to her, Chase starts to take note. Most of this is harmless, a relatively offhanded comment every now and again, but this seemingly irreconcilable tension begins to form between these two characters as Chase values teamwork and open, honest communication, and all that Invisigal knows is running away. This all comes to a head in one of my favorite sections at the end of episode 6 at Robert's house party with the Z team and co. First things first, I just want to mention how well this whole sequence is put together, genuinely taking into account the choices you've made up until that point, how honest you are with your team, and who you've chosen to get a little closer with. As the party winds down, the team get to discussing a lead that they have on the Astral Pulse, the power core for Robert's mech suit. Busy realizes that they could feasibly retrieve it that night after figuring out its location. Blazer reasonably protests, but Invisigal, never being one to curtail to authority, protests right back, prompting Chase to step in.
Robert doesn't need to keep going out there with no powers, putting his life on the line to make up for assholes like you. He doesn't need to be Mecha Man to be a hero. You playing them, you playing yourself. You think you're invisible, but I fucking see you.
You don't know anything about me.
The fight that ensues, it's shocking, sure, but I think it's important that the quiet moments that follow are some of the game's most impactful. Robert has a really tender conversation with Chase out on the balcony, and Chase asks, why do we even help people? They oftentimes aren't grateful, they probably won't thank you, and Robert, at least my Robert, says, it's just the right thing to do. We go through life as a product of every experience, our upbringing, the struggles, and the times of abundance. We're molded by everyone we've ever loved, by heartbreak, by cold winters, and by the desire to take pictures of the clouds as the sun set behind them. And in that, it's undoubtedly true that some people have just been dealt a better hand than others, be it support systems or just sheer luck. Robert and Chase talk about this too, specifically in reference to Vizzy. Without the communities that they were a part of, the people around them, where would they be if their starting line was completely different? Yes, Invisigal is arrogant and difficult to deal with, but a lot of that is nothing more than a defense mechanism that she developed living the life that she's lived. And to some extent, all that she needs is a little bit of patience, someone to extend the olive branch and give her another chance. I think that says so much about the world that we're living in, with people so quick to judge those less fortunate than them, to ignore the needs of those that have had a rough deal, be it illness or loss or poverty, or the very easy to fall into existential turmoil of living on planet Earth in 2026. And it is that very existential turmoil that so many of us face. It feels like every day there's a catastrophe. Anti-immigration sentiment is ramping up in Australia, the US government is invading sovereign nations, and perhaps most terrifying, the state killing of Renee Good and Alex Preddy in Minnesota. It can be hard to escape the feeling that what we've got now, it might just be rotten to its core. But although it may be hard, it is indeed possible. The answers are out there, if you just listen to the wind. It wouldn't be a dispatch video without discussing our main guy, and I think that Robert's arc as Mecha Man really encapsulates this idea that the game is bringing forth, that fundamentally, second chances are a core of the human experience. The opening section of Dispatch sees Robert quite literally blow up his entire life. His conflict with Shroud leads to the only thing that allowed him to truly function as a superhero, his mech suit, get destroyed in an attempt to escape. Mecha Man, after healing from his injuries, makes a public statement about the incident. Robert is down on his luck. He's lost everything, including at least some of his reputation after being grilled by the media at his press conference. He lives alone in his apartment with his dog, seems to have ostracized basically everyone in his life, and without his identity as Mecha Man to drive him forward, he has no real sense of purpose or meaning. He's just floating through life, looking desperately for a line to grab onto. And just like Robert extends a helping hand to Invisigal later on, he finds help in an unlikely place. Robert's arc in Dispatch is not an unfamiliar one in superhero stories. Sure, The path of becoming a corporate powerhouse is, but a down on his luck hero building back up from rock bottom is not all that revolutionary. While we often see in stories a power in fierce independence, think something like Iron Man, where Dispatch differs in that regard, and quite importantly so, is the understanding that nobody can or should face the end of their world alone, and having the support of others can make all the difference. You can see how the writers communicate this feeling in a multitude of ways. Some are comedic for sure, but I do think work quite well to describe this life that Robert lives. While he was Mecha Man, he didn't have the time to do literally anything else, as evidenced by the fact that he has no furniture in his apartment apart from what seems to be a single lawn chair. He's so consumed by his work that he doesn't make time for anyone, for old friends, for relationships, for hobbies. Robert at that point is Mecha Man, and that's all that he is. It's all he's ever known, and were it not for his accident, that's potentially all he ever would have been. Someone that undoubtedly does some good, but is fundamentally going through the motions, and despite maintaining healthy relationships and touching grass every once in a while, I'm sure we've all felt like that to at least some degree, getting so consumed by work, so wholly enveloped by it, that it's hard to see anything else for what it truly is. I've spoken about burnout before on this channel. I have a whole video basically dedicated to it after I played Wonder Stop, and this approaches that idea from a different perspective. Robert's accident, it can be read in a lot of ways. It can be read as tragedy, such as losing a job, a loved one, a level of mourning, but it can also be read as necessary for part of Robert's growth, representing burnout to some degree, and his arc is about coming back from that when you feel like you've lost everything. It isn't easy, and it certainly is not linear, but it is possible, and it's clearly evident that a support structure around you makes this a hell of a lot easier. This does include friends like Blazer and Chase, but also includes the Z-Team, people that Robert is technically in charge of helping through their struggles. And it's this almost codependency. I know that doesn't sound like the right word, but hear me out. It allows Robert to dig himself out of this rut that he's initially found himself in. Robert did hit rock bottom, and it's clear that he thought he would never be able to do the superhero thing again. And it's that belief, the yearning for something that he had ripped away from him through no fault of his own, that leads very neatly into my last point, and that involves not just Dispatch, but the very people that made it. It may not initially seem like it, but there are a lot of moving parts in this story, and I think equally important to the game's themes is the context of its development. I spoke briefly on this in the intro of the video, but I want to go a little bit further into it. I promise this is all going to tie together in the end. In the lead up to the liquidation of Telltale Games back in 2018, 4 people would see a storm brewing and exit before the chips fell, those being Michael Chung, Nick Herman, Dennis Lenar, and Pierre Charette. Chung would go on to work at Night School Studio, the people behind a game that I am very fond of called Oxenfree, where Herman, Lenar, and Charette would all join up with Ubisoft, with the goal of starting a new studio internally that would work on narrative-driven adventure games, just like The Walking Dead or The Wolf Among Us, only to be shot down by upper management, which yes, that sounds exactly like Ubisoft. So we have a group of people all originating from a studio that loved the work they were doing, clearly evident by the fact that the games they were making were all fucking fantastic. We have an event clearly out of their control, video game executives doing video game executive things with a generational bag fumble, turning what was one of the most prolific and successful small studios into an expansive corporate nightmare, destroying the company and leaving hundreds of people without a job. We have to remember as well, this was pre-COVID, so layoffs to this scale were relatively rare, let alone for companies that looked relatively successful from the outside. We have some of the affected people leaving to start other ventures inside of bigger companies, only to be met with the same level of stagnation that killed Telltale in the first place. And finally, you have those very people coming together after years of hardship, years of changing plans, finally back to making the kind of game that they really wanted to make, and that is through the foundation of Ad Hoc all those years later. It is still crazy to me that Dispatch was initially supposed to be a sort of interactive live action piece, and were it not for a global pandemic making filming all but impossible, we would not have gotten the same game that we got all those years later. Dispatch is fantastic, but it certainly couldn't have existed without the journey to get there, and it goes to show that some of the best art comes from tumultuous times. Without the destruction of one of the most important video game studios of the 2010s and the pandemic, Dispatch could not exist in the way that it does now, and I think that makes it all the more meaningful. The keen-eyed among you will see the through line here. The context in which Dispatch was developed is entirely inseparable from its themes. We have a story about a hero who thought he would never be a hero again. We have a story about a downtrodden villain floating through life, and we have a story about a group of people that loved to make a very specific type of video game only to be disaffected by corporate interests, and in their pursuit of that very same kind of work were rejected by their following employers in the same way. To put it short, they may very well have thought that they would never be able to make that type of video game again. There is a very important motif placed consistently throughout the game, and that is the Phoenix. I know all of you know what a Phoenix is, but just in case, a mythical bird that in death will spontaneously combust only to be born again from the ashes. The Phoenix program, specifically reforming supervillains, I mean, it's literally in the name, but as I've discussed, I'm sure you can see this very idea. Destruction to something being born anew is littered throughout the whole game, from its characters to its development. It's a pretty amazing story, and speaks fundamentally to the idea that people can come back from almost anything when they have those around them that care enough to know. And I think it speaks volumes that all these years later, after the death and rebirth of a genre, I think that Dispatch might be my favorite Telltale game. And if you haven't played it, I mean, what are you doing watching a video like this? Please, go play it. It's really good.